And welcome to everybody. We're just making sure all our panelists are here, coming shortly. Thank you all for coming. I hope you're all enjoying your lunch. I'm Sonia Michelle. I'm Director of United States Studies here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm really delighted to welcome all of you here to this very special occasion, introducing or giving you a first look at a brand new report by the International Labor Organization, Equality at Work, the Continuing Challenge. The Woodrow Wilson Center, as many of you know, was founded in 1968 as a living memorial to President Wilson, and in keeping with the ideals that animated his life and career as both a professor and college president and as a public servant. The mission of the center is to create dialogue between the world of ideas and research on the one hand and the world of policy on the other. Also, in the spirit of internationalism that marked Wilson's presidency, the center seeks to bring together scholars and perspectives from around the world. Today's event, a first look at the new International Labor Organization report, Equality at Work, the Continuing Challenge, touches on three of these ideals: policy, research, and internationalism. First of all, workplace equality, identifying the sources of inequality and discrimination, is on the policy agenda of both developed and developing economy countries today. This report documents no fewer than 13 forms of discrimination. Second, while workplace inequality is often seen as a national issue, it is one that has international dimensions. In a global economy where not only goods but also workers are constantly traveling from one country to another, it is increasingly difficult to regulate workplaces and to protect migrants when they are working far from home. International organizations such as the ILO, not even such as the ILO, there's really only the ILO, can play an important role in encouraging and supporting both national governments and local and transnational enterprises as they address workplace inequality. And finally, as this report amply demonstrates, without adequate information, it is impossible to make policy advances, either nationally or internationally. The ILO is extremely impressive, not only in its ability to gather and analyze data, but also in its emphasis in encouraging countries to generate the necessary data in the first place. For all of these reasons, we're very, very pleased to be partnering with the ILO's Washington, D.C. office and with the No Limits Foundation to introduce this report to you. The ILO, as you will soon hear, is committed to building a future with decent work, and No Limits goals include building strong communities and a safe and secure world and protecting human rights. All of these pertain, of course, to the workplace equality issue. We congratulate the staff of the ILO for their fine work in producing this report, and we thank the ILO and No Limits for giving us the opportunity to work with them on this special occasion. We hope that today's launch will not only bring this important document to public attention, but will lead to the kinds of policies that will eventually bring equality in the workplace for all. Thank you for coming. I'm now going to turn the podium over to Ann Lewis, who is president of the No Limits Foundation. I'm not going to give a long intro for each speaker because you have their bios in front of you, and we have a very packed program. To save time, just let me say Ann Lewis.
That works. And Sonia, thank you. And let me say, on behalf of No Limits, we are so proud to be one of the co-sponsors of today's program. To the Wilson Center, especially to Sonia and all your team, it has just been a joy working with you. To Nancy Donaldson of the ILO and the ILO team, again, thank you so much. But to all the speakers, the participants, and those of you who are with us today who are making this meeting possible. We begin today an important discussion at a time of an economic downturn that has caused so much misery and continues to bring pain. How do we continue our commitment to equality of opportunity, to building a world in which every person has a chance to make the most of his or her God-given talents? From the authors, we will hear firsthand, get a look at the ILO report that is being released worldwide today on the reality of today's global workplace, the kinds of discrimination that confront today's workers. And we'll also get the benefit of your recommendations on how to do better, and we're waiting for those. And then, to help us think through this issue, we will hear from a terrific set of governmental and non-governmental leaders from labor, business, non-governmental organizations, that civil society whose participation is essential if we are to make meaningful and lasting change. We will talk realistically about tough economic times, but we can also talk just as realistically about economic possibilities, because building a more equal workplace is not just the morally right thing to do, it is economically wise. Discrimination, which devalues the contributions of workers because of sex or race or religion, or bars them entirely from participation, does not just injure an individual, it shackles the entire economy. A society which denies the talents of immigrants denies itself the chance to host the next Google. Women invest 80% of their income in their families and communities. When women are overworked and underpaid, their children are denied access to food and education, and the cycle of poverty continues. That kind of discrimination is not just cruel, it is economically short-sighted. By building a world that welcomes the talent, the energy, and the contributions of every nation, we increase the number of consumers and producers in every society and expand national economies. Equity is good for the bottom line. As Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, it is particularly important that women and minorities have access to opportunity and participation. Nations cannot flourish if half their population is consigned to the margins or denied their rights. The economic crisis of our times is a powerful reminder that we cannot afford to continue the wasteful, discriminatory practices of the past in which societies restrict themselves from full use of some of their most valuable natural resources. Today, we begin an important discussion of strategies to build a socially just, more inclusive, and more prosperous world. Thank you, and now to our moderator, Sonia Michel.
Let me just say a couple of words about how we're going to proceed. We're going to, as you can see on the agenda, we're going to start out with a presentation of the report by its two authors, Lisa Wong Ramasar and Guy Ryder. Then we're going to have responses from some public officials and people involved in various advocacy organizations who are very much concerned with issues of workplace equality. They're going to offer some remarks on the report, and then we're going to open the floor for discussion. I know that a lot of you here are deeply involved in these issues, and we hope that we'll be able to hear from all of you over the course of the discussion. So first, just let me briefly introduce first Lisa Wong Ramasar, who is a senior officer in the program to promote the fundamental principles and rights of work and rights at work, and is the principal author of this wonderful report, the global report on the International Labor Organization's 2011 Global Report on Non-Discrimination in Employment and Occupation. And I should say that the report is being prepared as a run-up to the 100th annual convention of the International Labor Organization. So it's very timely publication. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Lisa.
Thank you, Sonia. It's indeed a pleasure to be here this morning to share with you the findings of this global report. But before doing so, I'd just like to briefly explain rather what the global report is about, why we've produced it, why we do this annually. The report is supposed to provide a global dynamic picture of discrimination, the challenges, the good practices, on the legal front, on the policy front, and also give some practical recommendations of what should be done to improve implementation of these laws and policies. It's produced the one on discrimination at any rate is produced every 4 years. So the last one came out in 2007, and there was one in 2003. It's prepared as a follow-up to the declaration, the 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. And just as a note, on a sad note as far as I'm concerned at any rate, this will be the final report, final one of the cycle of the global reports on non-discrimination as of next year, as a follow-up to our 2008 declaration All 4 fundamental principles and rights at work will be captured in one single report. So you're seeing the end of an era here. This is the last. Let's just recall briefly the definition of discrimination in employment and occupation. This is taken from Convention 111, Article 1. You'll notice that it covers it covers 7 grounds of discrimination: race, color, sex, religion, political opinion, nationality, and social origin. Now, Article B of this convention, which is Convention 111, allows for inclusion of other grounds of discrimination considered relevant in the national context. Under American law, all 7 grounds plus age and disability are covered, so that's good. We also have here the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. GINA was most recently introduced, so they have been expanded. And my understanding is that sexual orientation and gender identity is also under consideration. Now, this year's report has been prepared under or against the backdrop of the aftermath of the global financial crisis. I must admit that the results are not necessarily that conclusive, primarily because data has been scant, concentrated on a few countries. When we started preparation for the report, there wasn't much out there, but nonetheless, we do have findings to share with you. I'll start with the positive trends. We've noticed an increase in laws. A lot of the new laws have introduced wider coverage of workers, certain categories of workers, also wider coverage of the grounds of discrimination that they deal with. There are also more policies in place, both at the national level and at the enterprise level. There have been a lot more family-friendly policies referred to in the report, and this is primarily with respect to parental leave, maternity protection, nursing breaks, etc. And finally, we noted that there were many more equality commissions or ombudsmen in place worldwide to ensure the better implementation of these new laws and policies. However, of course, all is not rosy. There's some, shall we call it, not so good, or rather bad news, primarily coming out of the crisis, because we've noted that there's been a tendency to give lower priority to policies that promote awareness of workers' rights during times of crisis. And in spite of the fact that we noted that there were more equality bodies or commissions established, as a result of the crisis, these commissions have become understaffed and underfunded. So not such a good thing. And in spite of the extended coverage of categories of workers in many laws and policies that we noted before, there are some groups of workers that still continue to be excluded. Workers such as casual workers, domestic workers, workers in export processing zones. We've also noted that victims of discrimination, even though there are these institutions in place, are often unwilling to exercise their rights in court due to fear of retaliation, the complexity of the procedures involved, and also their lack of faith in the system. And on another point, differences in definitions of discrimination have made data collection, or whatever data there is, practically of limited value. Data seems to be collected in a very ad hoc manner. There's nothing systematic about it, and that is not helpful in measuring discrimination. One of the main things coming out of the crisis that we found was that migrant workers were probably the hardest hit. Why so? Because they are often concentrated in sectors that were rather immediately affected by the crisis. For example, construction and tourism sectors. Another thing that we noted, and just as on this side, a lot of my examples will, of course, be US based, so bear with me. It's not that I'm picking on the US. The stimulus packages that have been put in place have not necessarily managed to correct the disparities that have been faced by certain workers, especially those that are typically disadvantaged. For example, here in the US, the stimulus spending was largely targeted to the construction sector. However, African Americans, which represent about 13% of the population, and women, which make up about half of the population, only hold 6% and 9.4% of those construction jobs. Just something to think about. If we go back a bit to the migrant workers, from this graph, we can see that there was an increase in unemployment between migrant workers before and after the crisis, except in the cases of Germany and the UK. In the USA, the gap opened up where previously it was negligible. And there was a sharp increase in countries such as Spain and Portugal. Concerning multiple discrimination, these are our findings here. We found that it's becoming it's becoming the rule rather than the exception. Just to show, a recent study undertaken by the University of California, Berkeley, showed that in 2010, unemployment for African Americans stood at 15% compared to 8.8% for white Americans. However, when this data is disaggregated by both age and gender, the unemployment rate rose to 43% for young African males and 37% for young African females. Okay, just in terms of sex-based discrimination, we note that while there has been progress, the problem still persists. In 2009, the EEOC here received just over 6,000 complaints based on maternity discrimination alone, as compared to under 4,000 in 1997. Surveys show significant rates of sexual harassment in the workplace as well. In the EU, for example, 40 to 50% of women workers, that's half of women workers, report some sort of sexual harassment. There are, interestingly, more complaints also being received from male workers. The EEOC here reported 16% of sexual harassment complaints coming from men in 2009, compared to 12% in 1999. Let's look at the pay gap. In 2010, the OEC reported an average gender pay gap of 17% in member countries. Based on the graph, you'll see that the highest recorded incidence is in Korea of 40%. Japan, it's more than 30%. Here in the US, it's between 15 and 20%. In Belgium, it shows the least, less than 10%. There's often the question, what can we do to reduce the gender pay gap? Our suggestions are introduction of a minimum wage, introduction of job classification systems, gender-neutral job classification systems. Trade unions can also include these in their wage negotiations and collective bargaining. Racial and ethnic discrimination, once again, like gender discrimination, even though it's age-old, it still continues. These are the challenges that we've identified in the report, and these are some of the advances that we've noted. But let's go to a slide which is probably a little more instructive here, showing the unemployment trends in the US between 2010 and 2000 and 2010. The figures show that the unemployment rate among African Americans is twice that of the white population, and that the gap has widened since the beginning of the crisis. In the case of whites, the increase has been by 4.7 percentage points. That's from 4.9% to 9.6%. But in the case of African Americans, this increase has been by 7.9 percentage points, from 9.4 to 17.3. Let's look at the situation on the other side of the world in South Africa, where we've had major advances in terms of racial and ethnic discrimination. However, as we'll see from the graph, these things still persist. In South Africa, by law, enterprises with more than 50 employees are required to ensure that blacks occupy what they term adequate positions at all levels. However, if we look at the graph, the small number of black men and women in top management positions compared to their share of the economically active population is an example of vertical job segregation. We have blacks who are more than 60% of EAP and whites less than 20%. In the private sector, whites are overrepresented compared to blacks and other ethnic groups, with whites being at more than 60% and blacks and other ethnic groups being at less than 20%. In the government sector, in public sector, however, blacks fare better, achieving 60%, while whites achieve 20% and other ethnicities less than 20%. Now, I already mentioned that the migrant workers were hardest hit as a result of the crisis. However, normally, migrant workers worldwide experience poor working conditions, low wages, limited access to benefits such as pensions, and often face xenophobia and violence. And this has worsened since the crisis. In 2008 in South Africa, for example, over 60 migrant workers were killed and more than 10,000 left homeless after acts of violence, which stemmed from job insecurity experienced or being felt or perceived rather by nationals. In terms of religious discrimination, the EEOC has registered an 18% increase in religious discrimination complaints between 2007 and 2009. In terms of political opinion, the right to hold and express a political opinion is closely linked to freedom of association. In several complaints that have been brought before the ILO's Committee of Freedom of Association, an examination of these cases often found that workers being accused of undertaking illegal political actions and who were hence discriminated against, losing their jobs, we found that these workers were in fact just exercising their legitimate trade union rights. Caste and class discrimination, yes, that still prevails today. A recent study in India found that applicants, for example, with Dalit-sounding last names were less likely, as a matter of fact, 2 out of 3 cases, to be called back for an interview when compared with applicants with other last names. To alleviate this problem, however, the government has since introduced a 5-year plan which introduces quotas into the public sector. They've been providing educational grants and subsidies, and also introduced self-employment schemes. We've also seen major advances in China, where discrimination based on internal migration of workers has been a problem for years. That is, workers who come from the rural areas to the urban areas. A new law has been introduced, which now gives the same rights to employment and the same benefits to those who come from the city and and the rural workers who have been in the city for more than 6 months. In terms of HIV and AIDS, I'd just like to highlight the provisions of the ILO's recommendations that was adopted last year during the conference, which states that HIV testing should be voluntary. Workers should have access to both pre- and post-test counseling, and all HIV-related information should remain confidential. In this day and age, one would think that that is a given, but unfortunately, it's not the case. The research has shown that some employers try to impose HIV tests in a sort of covert manner by indicating that an HIV test is voluntary, but if applicants refuse to take the test, they aren't considered for the job. Similarly, others do it in a different manner. They issue some sort of random quizzes, little tests at the time of application in an attempt to look for risky behavior in the applicants. In terms of disabilities, a survey by the US Department of Labor found that persons with disabilities had an unemployment rate of 16.2%, compared with 9.2% for those without disabilities. In 2007, the average earnings of a full-time worker with disabilities was $34,000 US, compared with $40,000 US for those workers without disabilities. In terms of age, in the US, for example, there has been a 37% increase in age discrimination complaints received between 2005 and 2009. In terms of sexual orientation, studies have shown that there is a wage gap of between 3 to 30% between gay and non-gay workers. One of the major advances noted in the global report is the December 2010 repeal of the US's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Similarly, in terms of genetics, another major advancement noted in the report is, on the legal front, is the introduction here in the US of the GINA law. In terms of lifestyle, the report only looks at two aspects of lifestyle discrimination, that's weight and smoking. A report by the International Journal of Obesity found that in the US, among women, weight discrimination is as prevalent as race, sex, and age discrimination. In terms of smoking, we've noted or found that there's been a shift from smoke-free workplaces to smoker-free workplaces, where a lot of employers are now recruiting non-smokers only. A positive trend, though, on the employer side is the introduction of workplace health promotion programs, where, for example, reimbursements are being given for gym memberships. There's been health counseling, health coaching, and there have been subsidies introduced for those who've quit smoking, etc. What has the ILO been doing? Over the past 4 years, the ILO has worked in over 44 countries worldwide, helping its constituents to try to reduce employment discrimination by implementing awareness-raising campaigns, conducting training workshops, undertaking research, providing technical advice, building capacity of constituents, developing toolkits, preparing publications such as these. What have those resulted in? It's resulted in the adoption of policies, improved policies and laws, adoption of new national action plans, and a better implementation of these laws and policies through our various technical cooperation projects and through our decent work country programs. Based on an analysis of the challenges identified in the global report, the ILO is proposing these 4 priority areas of action for the coming years, with particular attention being paid to equal remuneration between men and women, racial and ethnic discrimination, and equal treatment of migrant workers. Finally, as food for thought, we recognize that change will not come about overnight. Discrimination is deeply rooted and is cultural, and not necessarily a priority of many countries, in particular when trying to recover from an economic crisis. But the benefits of a diverse workforce, especially in a globalized economy, are well known. So we urge our member states to keep up the fight and work with us to progressively eliminate discrimination in employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. This, as detailed as Ms. Wong Ramasar's presentation was, it just begins to really indicate the tip of the iceberg. And the report, when you read it, you'll see is extremely rich and extremely well documented. And the issues that she raised are obviously of the utmost importance. And it's really good to see that, in fact, some of them are being addressed. But obviously, it's going to be a long haul. Guy Ryder, our next, the co-author of the report, is the executive director of the Standards and Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work sector of the ILO. And he, as I said, was a co-author of the report, and he has some remarks now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Let me first of all thank you all for being here. Thank you for your interest in the subject matter, the continuing fight against discrimination. And thank you also for your interest in the work of the International Labour Organization. It's a great encouragement to us, and we also are very aware that we can benefit enormously from your inputs into the work that we do in this area as we can in others. And what a great panel, what a great set of speakers you've got lined up. I think it's going to have an extremely rich conversation. I want to thank particularly my friends Ronnie Goldberg, who represents US employers in the ILO governing body, and Sarah Fox, who represents US Labour there and do a great job. Lisa has given you a very comprehensive, a very detailed introduction into the content of the report that we've produced for consideration at the 100th International Labour Conference, and I don't intend to repeat what she has said. She's allowed me instead to use the time I have to just make some rather more general reflections, which I hope might be of interest as we pursue the conversation in the time that we have available, about where we are and where we need to continue in the future. There is a temptation, and I confess, actually, I'm not a co-author of the report. That's a slightly fraudulent claim, which I should admit to. But when you look at it, and when you look at the evidence of continuing discrimination at work, and sometimes flagrant discrimination, sometimes overwhelming levels of discrimination, and with the appearance of new criteria, new areas of discrimination, I think we could be forgiven for surrendering to the thought that maybe we're going backwards and not forwards. But if actually you take a longer-term historic view, it's not the case. It's not the case. And I'm sure that if we look at our own personal experience, we can look at progress made, of attitudes changed, of levels of discrimination reduced. And it's very important for us to remember that, not simply not to be discouraged, but also to realize that determined action against discrimination produces results. Sometimes we need reminding of that, and I was reminded France has been celebrating, if that's the right word, the 30th anniversary of the coming to power of François Mitterrand. It was 1981, it was a long time ago now. And it looked at the way France has changed in those 30 years. And one of the things that it looked at was the reduction in the wage, the gender wage gap. When Mitterrand came to power in 81, it was 40%, 40. The French put it at 19% today. And as Lisa's shown, we've got this wage gap that continues to stick around the 20 to 25% mark around the world. It's a horrible indictment of the world of work, but the fact is it's better than it used to be. So that should encourage us to move forward. The other thing I want to say is that whilst Convention 111 sets out only 7 criteria for discrimination, Lisa showed them to us, our report covers 13. And it's, I think, a reflection of the fact that a situation is evolving and we're becoming more aware of areas of discrimination that perhaps were not previously evident to us. Doesn't necessarily mean the situation's getting worse. It means that our sensitivity to new issues is becoming more acute, and that is important. Now, we're all painfully aware that we live in circumstances of what we tend to call global crisis, although it's a crisis which is being felt very differently in different parts of the world. And we know that's having an impact to the world of work, and it's inevitable, it would be strange were it otherwise, that it's having an effect on questions of discrimination. A lot of work is being done, for example, on the differential gender impact of the crisis. I'm not sure that we can draw very many systemic conclusions from that. I think what you tend to find is that when the crisis hits, when it wipes out the construction industries it has in Spain, you get a major impact on men. When it wipes out the retail industries, it did in my own country, then women are affected. I don't think that our major focus of attention is there. I think the real danger of this crisis is that it creates circumstances of fiscal austerity, of fiscal constraints, which runs a risk of simply disinvestment in the infrastructure and policies that we need to make the fight against discrimination work. This is a fight in which we have to invest not just effort and attitude, but resources as well. Institutions work, ombudspersons work, this sort of stuff work, but it needs investment. And the danger is that the crisis will lead us to make false economies in that effort. And the second systemic problem of the crisis is it leads to a finger-pointing phenomenon, I put it rather crudely, against certain groups in society. We're seeing it for migrant workers. We're seeing it where governments are getting popular support for the notion that when jobs are scarce, we look after our own people first. That argument is gaining some political currency in the world of politics around the world, and I'm sure we can all think of examples of that. Crisis also inevitably inflames situations of conflict which are underlying in society, and they can bring out fault lines in society which lead to renewed, sometimes intensified discrimination as well. The phenomenon of discrimination is, of course, extremely complex, direct, indirect, structural. We could have a very long debate about the nature of discrimination and the types of policies required to remove it. The thing that I think we all need to be conscious of is that people look at discrimination in very different ways. The first time I had to deal with discrimination issues in the ILO was in the case of the so-called Berufsverbote in Germany, whereby post-war communists were excluded from public sector employment, and Germany thought that this was a perfectly acceptable piece of public policy. The German government defended it. The ILO felt that it was an act of political discrimination. I don't mention that to go into the details of that one case, but the fact of the matter is that in many areas of public policy there is not consensus around what does and what does not constitute discrimination, what is justifiable labour market intervention. These can be very difficult issues to deal with politically and technically. Convention 111, as I said, deals with 7 areas of discrimination, and there is a live debate, not a concluded debate in the ILO, about whether it would be beneficial for Convention 111 to be extended to cover other areas of potential discrimination. Lisa's pointed to the new recommendation on HIV/AIDS, which deals with discrimination in a separate instrument, and that's taken on board. But there is a debate about whether we need to go beyond the 7 existing criteria. It's encouraging, isn't it, to learn, as Lisa started off by saying, that US law addresses all of the areas of discrimination required by Convention 111 and 2 more besides. That's very encouraging, and it leads a simple ILO official like me to hope that we will be looking for a ratification of Convention 111 by the United States in a not-too-distant future. The United States is in a very small minority of ILO member states which has not ratified this, one of the most ratified of all ILO conventions. And Convention 100 on equal pay for work of equal value would be another very welcome bonus. Finally, those 4 areas that Lisa referred to where the ILO is proposing to the conference, but the outcome depends on conference discussion about where to put our efforts in the future. Pursue universal ratification and, more importantly, application of the ILO instruments which have to do with the fight against discrimination, knowledge development, knowledge sharing. I think this is classically an area of work where sharing experience of what works in some countries would be enormously beneficial in other countries. Working with our constituents, governments, employers and workers, to build their capacity to join and to contribute to the fight against discrimination at work. I think this is tremendously important precisely for the reasons that were mentioned in the introduction to our discussion. Eliminating discrimination is good for the bottom line. It's good for business. Business has been in the lead in recognizing the advantages of diversity and policies to promote diversity for their companies. There is a survey cited in the report which shows that 68% of companies surveyed saw benefits in promoting diversity. And it's logical. You want to make the maximum use of the talents of your workforce wherever they come from, whoever they are. It is good for the bottom line. For trade unions, when I started in the trade union movement 30 years ago, as I did, I could cite, and Barbara, you might be able to do the same, or Sarah, I could cite examples where trade unions were complicit in excluding certain categories of the workforce from jobs in certain sectors and certain places. I don't see that today. I think workers, trade unions have come an awful long way from that situation to one where Belgian trade unions are out there distributing Lithuanian language, Polish language leaflets to construction workers getting off the bus from Eastern Europe. Why? Because they want them as new members. A lot of evidence shows that migrant workers have a higher disposition to join trade unions than local workers. So good for the bottom line, good for the membership figures, and of course good for our economies, hence the government commitment as well. It's the right thing to do, and it makes a great deal of sense. My last word, though, is that this needs political commitment, this needs effort, beyond what is sometimes politically convenient, beyond what is sometimes apparently politically realistic. When I knew that I was going to have the privilege to speak at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I looked at my history books coming here. And as so often in US history, Woodrow Wilson apparently came and annoyed the Europeans immensely at the 1919 Peace Conference with his 14 principles, leading Clemenceau to say, the good Lord only came with 10 commandments. That's what we have to do. You have to be a bit unreasonable about this. One of my compatriots said that all important change was brought about by unreasonable men and women, had he been in this meeting. And that's what we have to be. We have to be slightly unreasonable. We have to push this package forward. And we hope that through our ILO report on discrimination, through your engagement, and through the engagement of the ILO's constituents, we can make sure that when we meet again in 5 years, in 10 years, the situation looks better. It won't be finished, but we will have progressed. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for those inspiring words. I'm a historian by training, and as I was reading the report, I was thinking 30 or 40 years ago, these categories, we didn't even have the language for these categories. So it really is a sign, something to be encouraging to see how the agenda has been expanding. We have with us an exciting group of commentators now who are going to talk about the report and its findings from their various perspectives in government and also in a number of advocacy organizations. We're going to begin with Barbara Shaler, who is Special Representative for International Labor Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. And if you read her bio, you'll see she has a long history, much experience in the field of labor relations. So please welcome Barbara Shaler.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thank you for the Wilson Center's very terrific opportunity to host the ILO here today. And I want to say a few words about the ILO very specifically, which is we are so, it is so important that the United States government, that the United States business community, that the United States labor movement has an organization in which the interests of working people is first and foremost their mandate, their objective, their mission. And we have such remarkable leadership at the ILO with very engaged Director General who in many ways conceptualized the ILO core conventions, helped the labor and business community identify them in the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. We have an excellent office here in Washington, now headed up by Nancy Donaldson, and a long history of many of you in the room of having worked with the ILO. Sally Paxton, I saw earlier, who served at the ILO for many years as the head of social dialogue. We have Karen Tramontano, who helps advise the Director General and longtime advocate of the work of the ILO. And I think because Guy's remarks were so expansive and so, in fact, insightful and political and historical, it kind of leaves us a little bit strained for how to fit in all of the comments that we were prepared to make. But I would say the large point that Guy makes, which is we have come an enormous way, in large part because of the work the ILO has done around these critical issues, but in our own country through the very animated involvement in movements that, you know, if we look back, all of us at this table look back 30 years ago, were there not a women's movement, we would not be where we are today. Was there not a civil rights movement, we would not be where we are today. Was there not a gay movement, we would not have been where we are today with LGBT issues. If there wasn't a youth movement, which at one point we all came out of, there wouldn't there wouldn't be much of the work that we've done, and that's true now with the disability movement, with a migrant movement, with the work that we're doing around immigration. So this very important construct of having an historically important international organization identify these core areas of worker rights, and then to have the constituents that we are so appreciative of working with, the business community, the labor community, and those of us in government. So let me speak to a moment what we do in DRL around these issues. By very definition, the democracy, human rights, religion, labor issues are housed within the Bureau of DRL in the State Department, and it is our bureau that pays very specific attention in many different ways. Our first objective is to promote the core conventions, and we do that in a variety of different areas. We highlight where there are abuses in our annual human rights report. We also look at those issues in terms of our own country. So we report on issues where we are not living up to the standards that we would hope countries around the world would live up to. We help to convene these kinds of discussions, particularly with Sarah and the Bureau of International Labor Affairs. So the two bureaus that all of you have worked with very closely, DRL and iLab, have the major responsibility in the United States government to ensure that the work with the ILO is carried out effectively. So, I think the way Guy talked about the reality of the economic crisis that we've all lived through and that we are still seeing the manifestations and the negative impacts, the issue of discrimination is where there is significant concern. And even though some of it cannot be specifically, kind of qualified and quantitatively looked at, what you see, particularly in the dramatic events unfolding in the Middle East, is that youth unemployment and women's discrimination obviously is at the core of much of the very appropriate turmoil, people's desire to have a voice, to be able to have decent work. So I think the implications of having a report, this timely come out will be one in which we can kind of instruct our own work and think about how to formulate much of our work going forward. Is Judith Heumann in the room? Judith was going to join us. I don't think she's made it over. I would point that, again, in the State Department, these very specific areas that the report addresses have special representatives. So were Judith with us today, she is the special representative in the State Department on disability issues. So Judith looks at, promotes, works with countries around the world on these issues. And I think what the report, as I read it over the weekend, clearly brought up to mind is there are so many discriminatory acts that we're not totally aware of that are the consequence of thinking about employment issues. And I know, for example, in all the work that we're doing around election work in countries around the world, Judith will always ask, do people with disabilities have access to polling places? Can they get to, in Egypt now we're looking at the ability of a significant part of the population having disabilities. So do they have access to participate in the democratic process? So we're so used to thinking about discrimination perhaps in the ways that was most apparent around race, around gender, but I think to understand fully the impact of discrimination on the world of work, the ILO report really does open up, broaden, and inform the way we should think about this work going forward. So this is an excellent opportunity to convene this roundtable discussion. All of you work on these issues, and most importantly, we hope that we will all stay together as we move forward, and who knows, we might even move towards an important historic ratification of a convention in the near future in the United States as well.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to hear from another branch of government, of course, the one that is most concerned with labor in this country, and that is the Department of Labor, where Sarah Manzano-Diaz directs the Women's Bureau. Welcome to Sarah Manzano-Diaz.
Thank you, Michelle. Hi.
Morning.
Good morning, or is it afternoon yet?
It's afternoon.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for Sonia and the Woodrow Wilson Center for having such an incredible convening us all for this incredible discussion. And also I want to thank the both of you, first of all, for writing the report because it's very timely, and also for promoting the report. So I want to thank both Guy and Lisa, as well as my colleagues on the panel. I also would like to just acknowledge Ann Lewis for her tremendous work on women's issues over the years, and I just want to say thank you, because we all rest on the shoulders of the people who come before us, and Ann has been a trailblazer for all of us, so I just want to say publicly thank you to you, Ann. As I begin my remarks, I'd like to quote our president, President Obama, and he stated, "Today, women have reached heights their mothers and grandmothers might have only imagined. Women now comprise nearly half of our workforce and nearly the majority of the students in our colleges and universities. They scale the skies as astronauts, expand our economy as entrepreneurs and business leaders as well, and serve our country at the highest levels of government as well as our armed forces. In honor of the pioneering women who came before us, we recommit to erasing the remaining inequities facing women today. End quote. This is our president. This is his commitment to women. And not only has he talked about it, but he has shown it as well. I would like to say that during the Women's Bureau just celebrated its 90th anniversary. We were created in 1920, 2 months before women actually had the right to vote. And so I'm very proud of the history of our Bureau. And I just want to share that one of the things that we've been able to do is advocate on behalf of women. So, for example, in the 1930s, there was the Fair Labor Standards Act that was created. Well, it was the Women's Bureau that was very instrumental in including women in the Fair Labor Standards Act back then. But we were also instrumental in the Equal Pay Act of 1963. In fact, in my office, I actually have the pen that President Kennedy used to sign that into law because of the instrumental work of Esther Peterson and some of the others in the Women's Bureau. And of course, Title VII, the Title VII Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the Executive Order 11246, which bars discrimination with regard to federal contractors. So federal contractors, people doing business with the federal government, are not allowed to discriminate based on race and gender. There's also the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, as well as FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, as well as the NLRB, which is helping in terms of the enforcement on behalf of women. So the United States has a history of fighting, of struggling behind this issue, as you know. But we do have a good record, at least of laws internally, that we have tried to promote and also tried to enforce. So we're using governmental actions as a way of addressing discrimination. But we're not standing still. We're moving forward, and we're building on what we've done. Our mission at the Women's Bureau is to safeguard the interests of working women. It's also to advocate for their equality and economic security for themselves and their families, and promote quality work environments, because that's also very important, and safety in the workplace. Our vision is to empower all working women to achieve economic security. And our secretary translates that as good jobs for everyone. And of course, I translate that as good jobs for women. So we are focused on the conscious inclusion of women in the workplace. And we are targeting the most vulnerable women and women who may be victims of multiple forms of discrimination. As a Latina, as a woman of color, I understand that very well. The Women's Bureau has been working closely with business, with labor, with women's organizations on all of these priorities. Our 4 priorities are getting women into the higher paying jobs of the 21st century. According to BLS, we know where those jobs will be. Green jobs, non-traditional jobs, science, technology, engineering, and math, white-collar jobs. And what we're trying to do is focus young girls to start thinking about jobs in non-traditional areas. Because even though women are getting more degrees now than ever, and probably more than men, less than 10% are concentrated in the STEMs. The Women's Bureau is also focusing clearly on green jobs for women because that's the wave of the future. And when we did a listening session around the country, women said to us, green what? What is a green job? So shortly, we will be coming out with a guide, which is called Why Green Is Your Color. And it will be a guide for women to understand not only about what green jobs are, but also entrepreneur opportunities. So what we're doing is we're going green. This is our wristband. It's a very nice wristband, but it says the Women's Bureau, and it has our website on it. But what it also has is a flash drive. And what we will do is we're going to go green, and on this flash drive, we will have our report there, and we will be distributing it in a very green way. So I just wanted to let you know we're going green all the way. So I also want to share with you that the issue, besides pay, the next important issue that studies show for women is workplace flexibility and balancing work and life. And as I talk to international delegations, that's clearly one of the big issues that everyone comes to talk to me about. And working with the White House, the president, I don't think there's ever been a president in the history of this country to ever talk about workplace flexibility. But back in March of 2010, the president hosted a forum on workplace flexibility, and what he talked about was the importance of work-life balance. The First Lady spoke about it, and what they did was they raised this level of the dialogue to the White House and made it a national conversation and discussion. As a result, what we've done in the Women's Bureau is we've created a national dialogue on workplace flexibility. And what we do is we have reached out to the business community, to the women's groups, to the unions, and we have been working collaboratively with all sectors and researchers as well to talk about what are the best practices when it comes to workplace flexibility. And we've been working very closely with them, and they have been very supportive of our efforts. What we do is we have a business-to-business discussion in which the businesses that are doing it correctly, we highlight as best practices in a variety of areas. We had 10 major dialogues, and where we started in Dallas, and we focused on how do you do flexibility for small businesses, because people believe that if you have a small business that it cannot be done. In Atlanta and Seattle, we talked about how do you do flexibility in the healthcare industry. In Los Angeles, we talked about low-wage and hourly workers. In Kansas City and Missouri, we talked about retail. How do you do flexibility in a retail setting? In Washington, D.C., as well as Denver, we talked about the hospitality, restaurant, and tourism industries. And in Chicago, we talked about manufacturing. And in Boston, I just came back from Boston about a week or so, and we talked about how do you do flexibility in educational settings. The reason why we chose a variety of industries is that people think that flexibility is just one thing. But there's 3 issues that we have to keep in mind. It is when you work, how you work, and where you work. So depending on the nature of your industry, it will determine what kinds of flexibility is more appropriate. The last dialogue I want to share with you will be on professional employees, and that dialogue is going to take place on the 30th of June in New York City. And the other thing is that we've thought about not just workplace flexibility for just women, but what about the issue of disabled workers? So we're working very closely in partnership with our Office of Disability and Employment. And what we did was we created a roundtable on flexibility for disabled workers. And it's a very rich discussion that we had, and we're going to come out with a report as well as a toolkit so that other members of business can take a look at that and see what are the best practices. So we think that it will help inform policy and encourage adoption of workplace flexibility within the workplace. The other thing I want to share with you is on May 3rd, the Department of Labor issued a report called Women's Employment During the Recovery that provides important insights about women workers in the United States. This is what it looks like. It's on our website. I would encourage all of you to take a look at it. So this came out on May 3rd, so this is the latest information with regard to that. So I wanted to have the opportunity of sharing that with you. As we know, in terms of the issue of equal pay, that's an issue that clearly is not just limited to the United States. What we do know is that, in terms of the statistics, that on the average, women make 81 cents to that of a man. But we also know that women of color make less. African American women in the United States earn close to 69 cents to a dollar, and Latinas earn 60 cents to a dollar for every male. So the question is, why is this important? Why is this whole pay gap important? The pay gap is important because it really shines a bright light on the disparity of income available to mainstream households in America and American families, particularly single women and particularly women of color. For millions of working women, the gap means at least 20% less to pay for housing, to get gas, and you know these days that's a lot of money that it requires to get gas to get to work, utilities, food, college education for their kids, as well as retirement. We had Lily Ledbetter come and visit us, and what we did was we calculated her wage gap from the moment she became a manager all the way into retirement. And what we calculated was that she lost over time not just the day-to-day ability as to whether or not she could put food on her table, but because her Social Security income is based on her retirement income is based on her actual incomes, that we noticed that over time, she ended up losing close to $360,000. So it's not just what it does today, but it's also the accumulative effect on women. So in 2009, President Obama established the National Equal Pay Task Force. And the Equal Pay Task Force is part of a joint effort between DOJ, Department of Justice, EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as Department of Labor and the Department of the Office of Personnel Management. And what we're doing is we're working closely together to ensure strategic enforcement of pay discrimination cases and also help to reduce the persistent pay gap between men and women. So the Women's Bureau last December hosted an Equal Pay Research Summit. And we brought in experts to discuss the best approaches to gather data, to better understand the wage gap, and to figure out better ways of narrowing it. The Women's Bureau also is also in the process now of conducting forums across the country, along with EEOC, along with OFCCP, which is the Office of Federal Contract and Compliance. And what we're doing is we're targeting employers to let them know what their obligations are, as well as targeting employees for them to know what their rights are. And so the Department of Labor is working together across department lines. And part of what we're doing, for example, is the Office of Federal Contract and Compliance has just now hired over 200 new investigators to start working very diligently on this issue of pay gap, and many of them are bilingual. The Office of Wage and Hour Division is also ensuring that workers get the wages that they're entitled to. And as far as getting women into the higher paying jobs, we have our WANTO grants, and we provided $1.8 million in grants to support women in non-traditional jobs. Wage and Hour is also enforcing the new break times for nursing mothers under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, the Health Care Act that was just recently passed. And so we're working very closely with Wage and Hour to ensure that women are provided the appropriate workplaces for breastfeeding and also their break time. In addition, Wage and Hour also expanded its definition of what family is or parents are under the Family Leave Act. So, for example, the interpretation was broadened to clarify that the definition of in loco parentis includes employees who assume the role of caring for a child and receives the rights that a family has to leave, regardless of the legal or biological relationship. In addition, the Women's Bureau has commissioned a report under the American Time Use Survey, under which we will next year have data that talks about the diversity of workers' access to the use of leave. So these are some of the things that I wanted to share with you that the department is actually doing, in addition to the training grants out of the Employment Training Unit under the leadership of Assistant Secretary Jane Oates. So one of the things that I would like to also share with you in closing is that we think that what you have done is excellent, because what you're doing is putting center stage the issue of discrimination in whatever way it comes, whether it is under the 7 protected classes or whether it's the other expansion that you have in your report, and I really appreciate that very much. In closing, what I'd like to do is just share with you something that our president said recently, and I think that it really sums up where we're at. In America, we must lead by example in protecting the women's rights and supporting their empowerment. The president has also called on every agency in the federal government to be part of that solution. As we reflect on the triumphs of the past, we must look to the limitless potential that lies ahead. To win the future, we must equip young women of today with the knowledge, the skills, and the equal access to reach for the promise of tomorrow. Under the Obama administration, we are making unprecedented investments in education, and we are working to expand opportunities for women and girls in the STEM fields critical to the growth of the 21st century. We resolve, as part of the Obama administration, to build on the progress won by the trailblazers of the past. We must carry forward the work of women who came before us and ensure that our daughters have no limits in their dreams, no obstacles in their achievement, and no remaining ceilings to shatter. Thank you so much.
It's really wonderful for women to know that we have such a friend in Sarah Manzano-Diaz in our government. Turning now from government to labor, we have with us Sarah Fox, who is legal counsel to the AFL-CIO and serves as its representative to the International Labor Organization. Sarah.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today, and particularly at an event where we're able to host Guy Ryder, and who's had a wonderful distinguished career at the ILO, and whom we in labor have a particular feeling of pride in because he has also been a distinguished trade unionist and most recently the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. As people have alluded, as he's alluded to and as Barbara has, the ILO is unique among international institutions in that it is a tripartite organization that provides an institutional role for worker and employer voice. In the ILO world, there is a very important premium put on what is called social dialogue and the role of the social partners in joining together and working with governments and addressing issues relating to workers and worker rights. So I am particularly pleased today to be here with Ronnie Goldberg, who is my counterpart at the ILO and a representative of the AFL-CIO's most important social partner in the international arena, the U.S. Council on International Business. I also wanted to just take this opportunity to also note the relevance of the issuance of this report to this, what we hope is an important moment that we're at here in the U.S., which is looking at a very real possibility that we may be able to move forward in the U.S. Senate on ratification of Convention 111. And I want to say just right here that the AFL-CIO is enthusiastically in support of ratification and is prepared to link arms with our ally, USCIB, and our allies in the NGO community to get that done. So I'm here particularly to talk today about the role of worker organizations and in particular unions to address issues of discrimination in the workplace. As Guy has alluded to, it is not always a perfect history of the labor movement with regard to those areas. We have our own shameful moments with regard to those issues. But as he says, I think the labor movement and labor movements around the world have made huge progress in that regard and have really in recent years, in the last several decades, been at the forefront of efforts to try to promote fairness in the workplace. We do that through political advocacy, joining together with our allies, in particular through the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, in promoting positive legislation, most recently the passage of the Lilly Ledbetter Act to improve protections for women workers on issues of equal pay, on issues of age discrimination, HIV discrimination, LGBT discrimination, et cetera. But we also address these issues probably in the most important ways through collective bargaining. And collective bargaining is at the core of the rights that the ILO was established to protect. By negotiating in the workplace, if not specific protections against discrimination, at least through just cause discharge provisions, we provide both a private means of enforcement of those rights, particularly important now at a time when, as Guy says, with fiscal austerity here and around the world, the resources available for government enforcement of those rights are diminishing. And we also provide a low-cost method of enforcing those rights at a time when access to the federal courts and other forums can be prohibitively expensive for individual workers. So that's what we do here in the U.S. I also wanted to take a minute to talk about what we do, what the labor movement does internationally in the area of addressing discrimination in the workplace. And in that regard, I would start with just a quote from the recent annual report of the Solidarity Center, which is the AFL-CIO affiliated organization, which, with support from the AFL-CIO and a number of federal agencies, works around the world with offices in more than 35 offices around the world to work on issues of worker rights and helping workers come together to organize and, in many cases, form unions. In that report, it states, unions and worker organizations are often the early fighters against discrimination and other society-wide challenges. Unions have the motivation of workplace unity, the power of organization, and the benefit of legal tools to start addressing social issues. And much of the work that the Solidarity Center does around the world involves, in one way or another, addressing issues of fairness in the workplace and discrimination, and helping workers come together to address those challenges. I'm not going to go into specific examples of that now because I think it's important that we get to the discussion, and we'll have an opportunity then. Kathy Feingold, our International Affairs Director, is here today, and we can talk about some of those specific instances. But there are also important things that can be done in the area of cross-union alliances. There's a good example in the ILO report of a recently negotiated multi-union trans-border agreement negotiated to address the interests of migrant workers, which is, after all, an issue that is best addressed across borders by organizations on both sides. This agreement to protect migrant workers was negotiated with trade union centers from Sri Lanka, Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. So I think with that, I will just stop today and let the other speakers give their remarks.
Thank you very much. We're now turning to the legal realm and also another organization that deals very much with women's issues, and that is the National Women's Law Center, and our speaker from there is Marcia Greenberger, who is the founder and co-president of the NWLC.
Well, thank you very much, and most especially thank you for the invitation to be a part of this really quite terrific discussion, the opportunity to read the excellent report that the ILO has produced. I'm very honored to be here, and especially to be in the company of the conveners of this program, who have been in the forefront themselves on issues most central to the elimination of discrimination in the workplace and beyond, as have the panel members that I'm a part of. Well, my perspective is one of an advocacy organization whose job is to speak unpleasant truths to as many people as we possibly can find I like to say to be a spark plug, to be a prod. Many would say to be a pest in the effort to move forward, to try to take the very good advice, Guy, of perhaps some overreaching in the hopes that in good times we can make very substantial progress and institutionalize the kinds of institutions and principles and laws that will reinforce equality, and in tougher times to try to keep the backsliding to a minimum and keep pressing forward wherever we can find opportunities to do so. Well, I cannot say that even in my prodding way, I was able to find much to disagree with on this report. I found it to be insightful and very comprehensive. And I just wanted to pick out a few items that to me as an advocate from the outside seemed especially important to keep in mind and that resonated especially. First of all, that there are multiple forms of discrimination and multiple factors at work that are necessary to address in order to eliminate discrimination in the workplace. As a result, it's essential to work in coalition. There was reference to the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, a very key coalition in the United States, but it itself operates in coalition with many other partners, whether in the business community or internationally and nationally in the United States, nationally, but also in a state level and a local level, to be always alert to ways of pushing forward for progress. I think that in selecting equal pay as one of the areas of focus going forward, that was reflective certainly for the National Women's Law Center that has a particular focus on discrimination and economic security for women, is a primary area of emphasis and is absolutely central for women and for their families, as has been discussed. And of course, equal pay is very much an issue of concern to women, as everyone so far has recognized. But we face pay discrimination on all bases of discrimination, and for multiple bases of discrimination, as has been identified for women of color, for disabled women, for disabled persons of color. The multiple overlays of discrimination make the job all the more complex, less able to be stereotyped in one-size solutions, but all the more urgent to address in coalition. And that brings me to a second recommendation in the report that to me was especially important, and that is the role of data collection, and data collection that's disaggregated by subpopulations. That is something that in the United States we are far from having achieved. In fact, in economically difficult times, the effort seems to be to simplify and to streamline and to make what is seemingly less burdensome for employers or businesses to have to collect. But the loss of data has enormous implications in many different respects. And the fact that we have yet to really systematize the collection of data by subpopulations has kept us, I believe, from making the kind of progress that we really need to make. And I'll just highlight some of the reasons why. It's an old adage that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that is true for all players. From an employer perspective, we have found that often when confronted with actual data, many employers are surprised. They aren't aware that there are problems in their workplace. And if they have to collect data and have to look at how their actual workforce is faring by population and subpopulation, that often can be one of the most effective spurs to commonality of interest and purpose in forming coalitions to make progress.
It also is essential, obviously, to empower individual employees if they know that they are not alone. I cannot tell you how many times individual women have come to me and those of us at the National Women's Law Center having suffered in silence for many years, assuming that the problem is their own personal problem, either their own inadequacies or their own problem to solve, and that they are not situated in in common with others. So the trade union movement obviously has recognized the power of numbers. But where we do not have a unionized workplace, which in the United States is the majority of workplaces, and often workplaces where women are most likely to be employed, or the most disadvantaged are the most likely to be employed, the absence of information, the absence of understanding commonality of interest and circumstances can be a major barrier to progress. And that was certainly true in the case of Lilly Ledbetter that was referred to. And it has been one of my proudest moments over many years since I've been in the youth movement myself to have looked back on the Lilly Ledbetter case in the Supreme Court, which the National Women's Law Center participated in, but then all the more in the effort to ultimately pass the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which restored the law to what we thought it had been in terms of access to courts. But what was especially important about Lilly Ledbetter's story was that she had worked for almost 20 years for an employer, and the employer's policy was that you could lose your job if you discussed your pay with a coworker. That is not an unusual policy in the United States. There is a major case pending in the Supreme Court right now against Walmart. Walmart has a similar policy. That is, in fact, common. If an employee does not know how she fares as compared to her coworkers, then that lack of information can make it very difficult for her to understand how to take action, and that, in fact, she deserves to be able to take action. Lilly Ledbetter only found out about the fact that all of the male managers who had similar jobs over that almost 20-year period were paid more than she, no matter how junior they were to she as she continued to work, and how recent an employee they may have been. They all were paid more. That information came in the form of an anonymous note. Well, her being barred on penalty of losing a job from being able to discuss pay, I think does a disservice to an employer who was far better served from being able to hear from their employees and be able to know and be brought to their attention where the potential unfairnesses lie, than to have all of this shrouded in secrecy. So government has to do a better job of collecting the data and doing it by subpopulation. Government and employers need to be doing a better job in making sure that key data is able to be discussed and made public in appropriate ways. Obviously, we're not talking about publishing individual employees' salaries, but there are aggregate ways of publicizing pay gaps and pay disparities that could work to the great advantage of both employers and employees in securing change. A second quick suggestion and as to problems we face, in particular in this time of economic downturn, is you did refer to the fact that if you look at different sectors, you will see men or women faring differently during a period of economic downturn, depending on which industries are losing jobs at which times, and construction, for example, losing jobs early on. What we are seeing in the United States, and what used to be framed as a man session where men were losing jobs more frequently, is that in fact now it is women who are losing more jobs more frequently and slower in gaining jobs as the economy is starting to pick up. So actually, since the recovery began, women have yet to have any net increase in jobs. And that is largely because of the job segregation patterns that we see in this country, and especially because the public sector has been one of the sectors that women have turned to for employment opportunities. So as state and local governments are shedding jobs, not only are women and their families losing the essential services that these women employees provided, but the women themselves are losing those jobs. So they are becoming, and women are becoming, especially disadvantaged and hurt as the economic difficulties ripple through the economy given where they are located and the jobs that they have. And I want to make one last, I guess two last points as quickly as I can. First, that again, citing to the ILO report, multiple issues affect discrimination in the workplace. And there was reference to childcare. Well, clearly and obviously for families, the ability to be a productive worker is very much affected by the availability of childcare. And in the United States in particular, that has largely been viewed as a personal matter for individual families to provide on and contend with on their own. The National Women's Law Center certainly works on education issues, but we work on a broad range, employment issues rather, but we work on a broad range of issues including education. And we did a report recently on the Latina dropout rate and the crisis of young Latina girls dropping out of high school. One of the factors that particularly adversely affected Latina girls was the fact that when their moms needed to go to work and had no child care, it was their daughters who ended up having to miss school to take care of younger children or to care for other relatives. So their disengagement from school and then second generation and third generation to come was as hurt by the absence of child care as their parents in struggling to work in the first place. Finally, I want to say something that isn't always so welcome, and that is it takes penalties as well as carrots sometimes to make change. That as important as it is to make the case, the business case for diversity, and it is certainly there, as important as it is to look for coalitions in mutual areas of cooperation, and they are many and very productive. Sometimes people simply go ahead with the way things have always been, either because they like it that way or because it is simply disruptive and sometimes unpleasant to have to change. And that's where the economic incentive and the penalty comes in for employers to have to think that if they continue things the way they always have been, there could be a financial penalty at the end of the day. And the case that's pending in the Supreme Court now, the Walmart case, I think goes to that point very directly. Our laws in this country, primarily in the area of employment discrimination and pay in particular, are very prospective in nature. Those employers who are held to account by the government or in court cases are often told to shape up into the future and perhaps to go back and pay 2 years of back pay of what's been owed to an employee. Those penalties are capped in the United States largely, so that in a certain cold and cruel and heartless economic bottom line, if one doesn't adopt the more enlightened view that discrimination itself actually costs an employer at the end of the day, which is, of course, true, many employers can make the economic calculus that, well, maybe that's true for the end of the day, but I'm here today. And as of today, it's probably cheaper for me to just keep going as it is than to do the disruptive things of changing to improve things into the long term for the future. So we need to be able to hold employers accountable, to have strong laws with strong penalties, to have access to courts, to allow for strong class action cases, to allow for stronger penalties than are in the law right now. And certainly that is, as I go around both the country and in fact in many parts of the world, some of the problems and hurdles that we face as well. Thank you.
And our final speaker represents, of course, the third important leg in this tripod of government, labor, and business when it comes to labor issues. We're very pleased to have with us Ronnie Goldberg, who is the Chief Policy Officer for the U.S. Council of International Business, USCIB, and who also serves as the U.S. employer representative on the ILO's governing body.
Thank you, Sonia. The disadvantage of coming last in a very long, distinguished series of speakers is that many of the things I'm going to say have already been said. But anyone who's been to the ILO knows that's no impediment. Everybody has not yet said them. But in saying many of them, I'm going to try to emulate my friend and colleague Sarah Fox and be as high level and brief as possible, because I may not be standing between you and lunch, but I'm standing between us all and the discussion, which I think is part of the main object of the exercise today. So thank you very much to Sonia and the Wilson Center, to Anne and No Limits, certainly to the ILO and to Guy and Lisa for this very excellent presentation and an interesting and excellent report. I'm wearing two hats today, I should say, at the outset. I'm representing my own organization, USCIB. Our members are multinational global corporations, sort of at the cutting edge of many of these issues. But I also have the honor of speaking from the perspective of the International Organization of Employers, which represents employers at the ILO and is the counterpart of the ITUC. And I mention that in particular because employers at the ILO were not only supportive of the 1998 Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, from which this report stems, but we would like to think, instrumental in its creation and its passage. So it's very important to us not only that these principles and rights of work be promulgated and understood and implemented around the world, but that there be a robust and meaningful follow-up to that declaration. So why do employers care about discrimination in the workplace? Well, I'll give you three reasons. First, contrary maybe to popular opinion, we're human beings too. You know, it's the right thing to do. And we have a stake, like everybody else in this room, in the peace, health, and prosperity of the communities in which we and our families, as well as our clients and our customers, live and do business. Doing our best to strengthen the economic, political, and social positions of every member of society is fundamental to economic and social progress. We understand that. And thus we respect the obvious and compelling equity and human rights issues associated with anti-discrimination. Secondly, I'm going to agree with Marcia. We obey the law. And not only that, we recognize the need for national labor laws to recognize and accommodate the needs of groups that are vulnerable to discrimination, including women, but other groups as well. So there is it may not always be perfectly implemented, which is a different issue, but there is a robust set of laws around the world, and we like to think at USCIB that our companies have as their first imperative to obey the law. And I hope we can come in the discussion, though, to some exploration of the ways in which law and regulation may not be the panacea, which brings the issues of collaboration and working together, partnerships, and some of the issues or some of the institutions and activities that Sarah mentioned. And underpinning this for business, I think, is the third reason, which for us, you know, if Guy's job is to be unreasonable or an idealist, and Marcia's job is to be a pest, my job is to be practical. We're the employers, after all. So what companies are increasingly coming to realize is that there's a strong business and economic case for diversity and anti-discrimination, which are two sides of the same coin. The larger, more diverse, and the more prosperous the universe of potential employees and customers, the better for business. The more that decision makers in companies understand and reflect the diversity of their customer base, the better for business. And I should say, picking up on some of the discussion about STEM and women's education, the stronger and more work-ready and qualified for today's jobs, which means science, technology, engineering jobs, the larger that pool employers have from which to recruit and to hire, the better for business. So I'm going to give two very brief examples of two kinds. We talked about, or the report talks about 13 kinds of discrimination, or 13 aspects. And by the way, I hope, Guy, that we have an opportunity to revel a little bit in the ratification of Convention 111 as it is before we start adding more categories of discrimination. And we're back to square one in terms of U.S. ability to ratify. But I'd like to give just two brief examples of the way at least my companies are operating in the area of gender or women's economic empowerment, and secondly, disability. I have to repeat what's been said because I think it's so important and business understands this. As the repository of half of all human talent and potential, women are an underutilized and valuable resource. Unleashing their talent, their creativity, and their potential is a virtuous circle. It's obvious. It confers significant benefits for companies, but for women themselves and their families, to the benefit of our economies and societies as a whole. And I have to observe, by the way, that many of the things that we're talking about, for example, in terms of flexibility, of addressing child care or care of elderly parents, or family responsibilities at both ends of the spectrum, these aren't just practices or policies that benefit women, they benefit men too, as indeed many of the workplace approaches to dealing with women's economic empowerment. It's not just about women. So it seems obvious that businesses would want to invest in women as workers and executives and to benefit from the insight and diversity of the perspective they bring, not only to the boardroom, which is a hot topic now, but also to management and strategic settings. And I really think this is beginning to happen. Sarah mentioned a number of ways in which, under the auspices of the Department of Labor, companies are collaborating, sharing best practices. My organization, which also represents business at the OECD through the business advisory arm to the OECD, is in the midst of working with the OECD to set up an employers network on women's economic empowerment to help our companies share best practices. So we've got a lot of good practice and experience to share with each other, and a lot of excitement around this issue. At the ILO, we're very supportive of the work the ILO is doing. This is just one example on women's entrepreneurship, which is not exactly the same thing as empowerment, but not always the same thing, but also a very important vector for women. The same logic applies to dealing with the issue of disability in the workplace. Here too, of course, a lot of change has been spurred by legal requirements, and we recognize that. But we think there's also a strong business case for hiring people with disabilities, and that this is becoming increasingly well known and well understood. Companies realize that people with disabilities are productive, reliable employees. Some companies engage in developing products and services for people with disabilities, as well as for their families and friends. And this is an important area of business development. So a number of companies are joining in a public-private partnership at the ILO to address workplace diversity in this respect. The ILO is forming a global network of employers, organizations, private sector businesses, large and small, multinational companies, existing employer networks on disability, and non-governmental organizations for the purpose of both meeting the needs of the network members and advising the ILO. Advice to the ILO on such things as activities, projects, and products aimed to increase workplace diversity, open new markets, create job and training opportunities for disabled persons, as well as result in employers across the globe realizing that ILO disability standards, national non-discrimination and quota laws, and industry and company policies need to be aligned. The ILO believes, and we agree, that by participating in such a network and the knowledge sharing that it will facilitate, companies will benefit from improved productivity, reduced turnover, safer and better workplaces, and increased customer and community brand loyalty. Employer organizations will increase their capacity to address their member needs related to diversity, corporate social responsibility, legal adherence, and human resources. Now, I've quoted that out of the material that the ILO has produced relative to its disability network, but I think what I just said is actually applicable much more broadly to the issue of non-discrimination in the workplace. So with that aspirational conclusion, I think I will end and leave us some time for discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to our wonderful panelists, and now the floor is open for discussion. Please wait for the mic and identify yourself because we're taping this. Yes, Patricia Foxen from, I will identify you from National Council of La Raza.
Yes, I'm Patricia Fox, the National Council of La Raza, which is a Latino advocacy organization. I guess, well, as all of you know, some of the most vulnerable workers in this country are those low-wage workers who are being hired by subcontractors on a contingent basis rather than directly by employers. And of course, this leaves them very much exposed to many of the forms of discrimination that you've talked about, and leaves little accountability to employers who are benefiting from their work. And I guess my question is twofold. I was wondering how common this practice, it's fairly widespread in the Latino community and in the immigrant communities, but it also spills out into other communities. And I'm wondering at an international basis how widespread this is, and also what steps are being taken to deal with it.
Yeah. You raised the issue of misclassification of workers. So people are told that they're independent contractors and therefore have no benefits, the pay issue. Wage and Hour is diligently working on this misclassification issue of workers because it does deny them the rights to equal wages as well as benefits. So that's one thing that we're doing within the Department of Labor in terms of dealing with that issue.
I do, yeah.
Is it on? Yeah. Well, very briefly and inevitably oversimplistically, the whole question of safeguarding the employment relationship and the effects of subcontracting, effectively what critics would regard as a conversion of a labour relationship into an essentially commercial relationship, is a fairly hot debate at the international level. We've had several debates in the ILO, one resulting in a recommendation on the employment relationship. So the role of temporary work agencies as subcontractors is a matter, I think, for labour market policy makers around the world. I think it's quite illustrative, if no more than that, that in the recent labour action plan between the United States and Colombia, for example, contingent on a possible on the free trade agreement, the whole question of the employment relationship is centrally involved because it's being questioned, if you like, by the use of what they call workers' cooperatives in Colombia, temporary work agencies and the rest. So it is a major debate internationally. Certainly in Europe, it's extremely strong debate.
Let me just say that within the Department of Labor, if there's federal contracting involved, then the investigation will be handled by the Office of Federal Compliance, but a wage and hour would handle all others.
Other questions? Yes. Yep.
I'm Heidi Hartman, Institute for Women's Policy Research. Apologies for arriving late. I wanted to ask what the prospects are for 111, Convention 111 being ratified. Was that you, Sarah, that mentioned that? We could hear a little bit more about that. That might be encouraging.
Sarah, let me.
Oh, you go ahead.
So I think there's a technical answer and there's a political answer. The technical answer is the convention is sitting at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The technical answer is that the convention is on #1 treaty priority list of the United States government. So I think the political disposition of everyone in the room to help move this along would be appropriate and appreciated.
Yes.
Of course.
Let me just add to the technical side of things. In the U.S., there's a long-standing agreement, tripartite agreement, amongst the government, the AFL-CIO, representing workers, and my organization, that ILO conventions, in order to be ratified, should be submitted to a tripartite legal review. We call it TAPLS. It's the Tripartite Advisory Panel on International Labor Standards. The idea is that there is an agreement that we shouldn't use international treaties to change domestic law. So the purpose of submitting a convention to this process is to determine whether or not it is consistent with existing U.S. law and practice. TAPLS has examined Convention 111, and there is tripartite agreement that U.S. law is not only consistent with Convention 111, it probably exceeds the requirements of Convention 111. So we're not having a dispute between unions and companies or between anybody in the U.S. government. We're faced with maybe a different legal technical process within the U.S. government, and there may be other political issues involved. But as far as I think I can say, as far as organized business and organized labor are concerned, we're on the same page with Convention 111.
Thank you, Ronnie. That's a very important point to make because it will be important as the process moves forward.
And I would just add that the fact that it will have both business and labor support, I think, gives it better prospects than some of the other international conventions and other contexts that have, where there have been attempts to ratify in recent years.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, I want to thank the panel, all of you, just really for your presentations, for helping us think this through. We will go home and read the document in full. But I think we got such a rich sense today of what is there. And I'm going to take Andrew and Guy, starting with you. Lisa and Guy, I'm sorry, he's starting with you. Thank you. And Guy, as you said, we've come a long way in some ways. But okay, now we've got the next couple steps can be in many ways harder, particularly made harder by an economic downturn. We've talked about Convention 111 as being a useful and important step that we presumably could be poised to take. But I wonder if any of the other panelists, if any of the panelists would like to say, okay, if there was one other step, one other action that I would like to see happen here in the United States or even internationally, one additional tool that I could use from where I sit, or that I think I would make a big difference towards this shared goal, what would it be? Met with thunderous response.
I would say data collection and the gathering of data, because I think that that really paints the picture well. And I forgot who on the panel was talking. Was it you, Marsha, that you were talking about, you know, just disaggregating the data and making sure that we have ample data to show the lives of all women or all underrepresented workers. I think that would be really helpful.
Not surprisingly, I think that the single thing that would make the most difference would be to remove barriers to unionization, increase the degree of collective bargaining, because unionization has historically helped reduce wage gaps between women and men, between racial minorities and others. And I think we see it particularly now in the public sector, the attacks on collective bargaining, that public sector employment has been in particular a route for minorities to enter the middle class. And I think as we see this, these attacks, I think it is a real jeopardy to progress in these areas.
Well, I'm incapable constitutionally of having one thing. So I would say everything everybody has always said, plus there is a piece of legislation pending in Congress right now, the Paycheck Fairness Act, that would be a step that includes some data collection issues, not that they couldn't be done administratively, that deals with remedies against retaliation if one discusses one's pay with coworkers voluntarily, that enhances some of the damages that can be collected by individuals if they prove pay discrimination, and has some other very important provisions in it. It did in the last Congress pass the House, but it came up short with 58 votes in the Senate, so we'll have to see where it is. But that would certainly be a step along the way.
Well, I'm having trouble with this question because I honestly don't think there's a magic wand solution here.
How about a wrench?
What, well,
pliers, you know, just a little tool down there.
well, I really think it's hard to answer constructively unless we're all talking about discrimination in the same specific context. Because one of the things that comes out of this report, and it came out of our discussion today, is how immensely, first of all, how immensely complex these issues are, given not only the subtlety and the diversity and the complexity of dealing with, let's just say, gender discrimination, but because of the complex interplay of different forms of discrimination. And if you take that out of just our own domestic context, and look around the world, we're facing an enormity of complexity and diversity. It sometimes seems to me rather egocentric or U.S.-centric or developed country-centric to be focused on, let's say, how many women sit in boardrooms, or even gender pay gaps, when there are women in many parts of the world that would love to have a gender pay gap because they can't leave their houses. or have so many other barriers to even educating their daughters. So I have trouble focusing on that unless we're talking about a very, very specific, or we're clear that we're all talking about the same thing. I'll leave it there.
So I would add, given that you've all heard it here, the AFL-CIO, the international business community, and the government support the ratification of 111. I think one of the most important things we can do for the United States is to ratify the convention and for us to show that these issues affecting discrimination around the world are appropriately dealt with, and the ILO and the core labor principles would certainly take us an enormous step forward, and it's important that we address this issue now.
Any further questions? Well, I want to thank once again Lisa Wong Ramasar and Guy Ryder for coming here from Geneva to present this fascinating report. Reading it, you'll find even more than we've been able to discuss today. But I think the panel also really showed us how the U.S. is obviously very much involved in this, that labor is not just a U.S. issue, it's an international issue. There are things that we can do to help further labor rights internationally, and there are also things that organizations like the ILO are doing to help us, and so that's really very heartening. And I hope we'll all take some energy from this and go forward and try to bring greater equality in the workplace the next time we convene. Thanks again to everybody for being here, and thanks to our panelists.
It was a pleasure to meet you, Marcia. Yes. And I'm sorry you gave me your card, but I didn't see where you're based.